A man and a woman walk along the idyllic Chesil Beach. They are Edward Mayhew and Florence Ponting. They just got married earlier that day and have checked in at the small hotel nearby for their honeymoon. They are talking about music, with Edward making comparisons between rock and roll, his favorite music genre, and classical music, his wife's preferred music genre. They return to the hotel. There, Florence makes a comment about Edward's favorite musician, Chuck Berry. She says he sounds merry and bouncy, which makes Edward smile. He appreciates his wife's astute appreciation for his taste in music. He lovingly embraces her as he remarks on how beautiful their wedding was. Even his mother behaved well. Florence comforts him, as she understands her husband's worry. They kiss, but she cuts it short to tell him she has decided that, if they are to have a daughter, she's going to name her Chloe. Edward says it's a beautiful name, before continuing to kiss her. He can't wait until he lays his wife on the bed. But several knocks on the door tell them it's not yet time to consummate their marriage. 2 waiters have arrived to serve them their dinner, and at an early time. The couple is quiet as they observe the waiters set up their table and serve them fruit. This is the first time Edward and Florence have been alone since becoming husband and wife. Tension and awkwardness seem to simmer just below the surface. Edward is uncomfortable with the presence of the 2 servers, while Florence seems to be holding herself well. Once the main course is served, the 2 servers stand by the door, waiting for their tip. Edward is embarrassed when he doesn't get this social cue. When the servers have left, the couple continues to eat in silence. Then, Florence suggests they take some fruit and wine outside to enjoy the last hours before sunset. Edward is not agreeing, because he's thinking about the effort to set up their table. In addition, he's looking forward to bedding her, so he doesn't understand the point of watching the sunset. But he's very conscious of his actions, so as not to upset his wife. Florence looks uneasy. She thinks it's her silliness that's causing their first argument. No matter how insignificant it is, she looks tense, as she wants everything to be as perfect as possible. Just from their interaction alone, one can see that they have differences in personalities and character backgrounds. Edward tends to act according to his wants and emotions, while Florence seems to be a perfectionist. We see the first of the many flashbacks of the movie, where Edward's family home is shown. The house is unkempt, but he is used to it. Once in a while, he gets interrupted from reading his book by his mother having one of her unusual episodes. She does weird things, and this time she's in the garden stark. His father runs to cover her. His 2 siblings, twin girls, simply watch as things unfold. Meanwhile, Florence is from an affluent family, with an uptight mother who is very politically opinionated, a younger sister who looks up to her, and a strict father. It's worth noting how Florence gives the slightest flinch when her father gets near her. This detail is important to understand what is about to happen later. In the present, the couple decides to talk about things to calm themselves. Florence recounts the first time she rode the train to London. She says she was nervous about simply buying her first ticket. It was her first taste of freedom. On the other hand, Edward talks about her mother's situation. Marjorie Mayhew is viewed by others as mentally challenged because of her eccentric behavior. One can say that this is just her version of artistic expression. But Edward recounts the incident where Marjorie was hit by the open door of an oncoming train. She was on the platform, standing too close to the edge. Edward believes this incident was the major reason for his mother's condition. From his point of view, this belief gives him a sense of freedom, because he is sure he won't inherit his mother's condition. He still loves her, but he finds comfort in knowing he won't grow old and brain-addled. The flashbacks continue as we see the fateful day when Edward and Florence met. A postman came along and gave a letter to Edward. When he opened it, he received pleasant news. He was in first place in his class. He majored in history at the University College of London. Graduating at the top of the class was such a huge honor for him. He showed his mother the results, but Marjorie was too preoccupied by her painting. Disappointed, he showed his results to his twin siblings, but they couldn't care less about his academic achievements. He called his friend to share the news, but he found out his friend had gone overseas. Upset about how no one seemed to recognize his success, Edward decided to travel to Oxford. While dilly-dallying on the streets, he happened upon a CND meeting. Perhaps someone there might see the value of his getting first place as a history major. Just as he entered the room, he saw this beautiful lady with striking blue eyes looking back at him. He had yet to know her name was Florence Ponting, but he was too enamored by her beauty. Florence seemed to feel the same about him, as she found herself shy around him. Edward took this chance and told her he got a first in history. At last, someone could appreciate his win. Later, Edward and Florence walked along the park. They told each other things about themselves. Edward told her he wanted to write books, recounting the side characters that made history more colorful. Florence said she was still waiting for her results. She majored in music and is currently a member of a string quartet known as an Ismore. She's one of the two violinists, along with a viola player and a cellist. She aspires for her quartet to become recognized and successful. Edward thought Florence also deserved to be appreciated, so he gave her a small flower as recognition for her achievement. We go back to the present, where we see Edward and Florence still sitting by their dinner table. It's clear that Florence is nervous, but she's trying to hide it. Edward is anticipating too much about their expected union. He goes to her and tells her he loves her. It's true, but as of that moment, he has one goal in mind. He attempts to be more intimate. Florence stops him. She says she's too uncomfortable doing it when the windows are open. Edward looks around and sees what his wife is talking about. He understands her discomfort, and so he thinks it's only right to do it in the bedroom. He leads her there. He tries to undress her as slowly as possible. He even suggests undressing her on the bed, thinking it will make her feel relaxed. He can't see her clenched fist or sense her growing anxiety. In the end, she stops being intimate with him again. She says she needs to remove her shoes, but she won't let him. Instead, she sits down to do it herself. A part of her mind wonders if she truly loves Edward. Because if she does, then why does she greatly hesitate? We see another flashback of Florence, and this time, she was talking to her sister, Ruth. The latter had asked her why she loved Edward, so Florence enumerated the reasons. First, he was not like any other man. Next, he always had a history book and a pencil stub, which she found endearing. He also knew the names of trees, flowers, and constellations. He wore plimsolls instead of loafers, and his socks were always mismatched. There were other things, but Florence found them all adorable because they made Edward a genuine person. Ruth said their mother called him a country bumpkin, but Florence ignored it. Later, she was with Edward, cruising along a charming river. They stopped at a grassy riverbank to rest. There, Florence continued to enumerate the reasons why she loved him. She said she liked the way he stopped at the doorway, looked around as if he owned the place, before he stared her out. They looked at each other, and they shared their first kiss. It was then that Edward asked her if it was love at first sight. In the next scene, we see Florence playing her violin along with her quartet. She led the group in practices and chose the pieces to play. She introduced a new member, making their group a quintet. The others were not so happy about this idea, but Florence refused to give any explanation. After their practice, Florence rushed out to make it to her work. Charles, the cellist of the group, called out to her to invite her for a coffee. He had always liked Florence and her vision for their group. But Florence went straight to Wigmore Hall. She worked as a page turner, assisting famous pianists during their performances. Florence dreamed that one day, she and her group could perform here and receive standing ovations from the audience. Back to the present, Florence stands up after removing her shoes. She walks closer to her husband. She says she's a little bit scared, but she can never admit that she hasn't been consciously intimate with a man other than her husband. Edward says he is scared as well. In truth, Florence will be the first woman he'll make love to. In his mind, he's scared because he may mess up. Even so, he's eager to do it. He loves Florence so much, he tries to unzip her dress, but the zipper gets stuck. That short, sweet moment suddenly becomes clumsy and frustrating. Edward curses at his inability to open a zipper. Florence is worried. She prompts her husband to sit on the bed to, again, calm their nerves. She remarks about how he easily gets cross most of the time. Every time it happens, Edward looks frightening, like he wants to hit someone. She asks him to tell her about the last time he got into a fight. She wants to have at least a good idea about his worst side. Edward is hesitant. It's not his proudest moment, but he relents. He recalls the incident that happened during his last year. He was in a club, enjoying a band playing good rock and roll songs. Among the audience was Harold, the smartest in their year. Edward admired him and wanted him to take him seriously. When Harold left the club early, Edward volunteered to accompany him. While walking, a man and his wife walked past them. The man suddenly hit Harold, calling him a Jew boy. It was an insult Edward wouldn't take lightly about his friend. He punched the man and kicked him, even when he was on the ground. The wife was screaming and crying, while Harold was standing there speechless. To Edward's disappointment, Harold left them there and never talked to him again. Florence admonishes Edward for his impetuous behavior. She makes him promise to never fight again, and Edward does so. Then he asks if he can remove her stockings. Florence becomes anxious again, so she says she'll do it herself. Edward watches, easily affected by this simple yet sensual gesture. Then she distracts him by recounting another memory of the past. She recalls the day she visited Edward at his part-time job. At the time, Edward worked at a croquet court, flattening the lawn. She remembers feeling so proud of herself for traveling that far. She told him of her journey, saying she was happy to see him again. After his work, they walked through the woods, where he helped her identify the names of the birds based on their sounds. Eventually, they arrived at Edward's home. As mentioned before, Edward didn't grow up in a well-off family, but Florence didn't mind the state of his home or his background. She also comforted him, since he was worried about his mother, not remembering his girlfriend. They enter the living room, where Marjorie is busy with her paintings, and indeed, she doesn't remember Florence. But Florence shows her kindness and sympathy as she clothes her. Edward has to run to the kitchen to hide his crying. It is a moving moment to see someone show understanding toward his mother. Florence is well loved by his family. They accept her immediately and let her eat with them at the dinner table. Back to the present, Edward interrupts Florence by holding her hand. With just one look, he reminds her of why they are in bed, of their first duty as husband and wife. She lays down, her heavy breathing masking her anxiety. As Edward's hand slowly feels her legs up, she asks him how many girls he's been with. He evades the question by saying, "Not that many," and he continues to kiss her. She clenches her hand as she tries to guess how many girls her husband has been with. She even asks for their names. Edward can't understand why she is asking these questions. To appease his wife's curiosity, he finally admits that she's the first. Florence is having another round of recollections. She remembers the time when they were at the cinema. They were surrounded by many couples who prioritized kissing over watching the film. When Edward tried to do the same, she stopped him. She remained stoic and focused on the film, even if she could feel him looking at her. In the next scene, Florence brought Edward to the quintet's practice. She only introduced him as someone when Charles asked who he was. Edward didn't mind it at the time, as he was busy eyeing Charles. After the practice, Florence brought him to Wigmore Hall. She wanted him to see the place where her quintet would perform and be applauded. She told Edward that when that day came, they would be playing Mozart's quintet so that he could sing along. She could already imagine the critics observing and watching them. Then, she remembers him saying he would be sitting at number 9, row C. From there, he would be shouting and cheering her on, and he would be the first one to say, "Bravo." After their visit to Wigmore Hall, they proceeded to Florence's unit, where they danced to classical music. Those were the times when they were carefree in their own world. Edward continues to kiss Florence as his hand finally reaches her underwear. He pulls it down. Then he kisses her again while trying to remove his shoes. He looks so clumsy doing it. He takes Florence's serious expression as her getting impatient over his awkwardness. But in truth, she is preparing herself for what is about to happen. She remembers that she specifically chose the lingerie she wears because she thinks it will help her mask her anxiety. However, she remembers her conversation with the priest who would officiate their marriage. The priest could see a little of her hesitation over the marriage. He tried asking her if there was anything that bothered her, but Florence insisted she was happy. To alleviate the priest's concerns, she told him about Charles Morrel and how he was taken with her. She also mentioned she didn't want her group to know about her marriage because she didn't want them to panic and think she'd leave them. However, the priest didn't buy her story. Florence knew then that she was only fooling herself. One might think the priest knew what was behind Florence's troubles. He advised her that it's not too late to turn around. There was still time to call off the wedding. Florence wouldn't listen anymore. She abruptly left the priest. Determined to convince herself that she was doing the right thing, she proceeded to read a manual about marriage and the lovemaking involved. She was horrified to find out that the husband was expected to enter her. Ruth accidentally found her there, reading the book. Florence told her what she understood, to which Ruth said that was simply ridiculous. This memory only shows that no matter how educated they are still lacking in certain aspects of womanhood, specifically about married life. Florence has to remind herself that it is her duty as her wife to give herself to the man she loves. But how can she focus when, every step of the way, her anxiety keeps getting triggered? She lays there as she waits for her husband to undress. When Edward is done, he lays on top of Florence. They both continue to make love based on how they perceive it should be done. They even try to talk dirty to each other. Unexpectedly, Edward comes. He is too stimulated by the feel of her hands on him. He doesn't manage to penetrate her. Edward screams as if he ingested a psychedelic, and his behavior greatly confuses Florence. She's still looking at him when he gets up. The image of him wearing only a white shirt triggers a series of memories for her. Memories of those times when she used to be alone with her father. At this point, the movie implies that she has experienced traumatic incidents with her which have now come back to haunt her at this pivotal point in her marriage. When she gets up, she sees the white fluid on her leg. It increases her humiliation. She demands Edward to look away. Mortified, she grabs her jacket and her shoes and runs out of the hotel. Edward wonders why Florence is acting that way. When she first brought him to her house to meet her parents, there were no concerns. Florence had no issue being affectionate with him, even in front of her sister Ruth, although she'd rather they have their privacy. At that time, she says her father wanted to have a tennis match with him. She told him to let her father win the game, but Edward wanted to prove he was worthy of Florence, even if he didn't know how to play. Later, he and Florence's father were driving to the factory the Pontings owned. It was settled then that Edward would be working for Florence's father until they could make it on their own. After a brief tour of the factory, they proceeded to the tennis court to have their match. At first, Edward couldn't return the father's serve. The latter was gloating at how he completely crushed Edward in succeeding sets. But through sheer dumb luck, Edward managed to gain a score. Eventually, the father almost gave in to his tantrums as the last set went to Edward. They shook hands, and as they were about to get their things, they saw Florence watching from the other side of the fence. The father's behavior suddenly changed. It was as if he was too humiliated by the idea that his daughter saw his loss. He even accused her of spying on him. He left Edward and Florence, thinking about what all that was about. In the present, Edward ruminates about what just happened. His embarrassment slowly turns into anger and scorn. He gets up and follows his wife, intending to know the cause of her behavior. He finds her at the beach a few minutes later. He confronts her, telling her it's unfair for her to run away like that, leaving him feeling unpleasant. Florence says she just needed to get out. She admits that what they tried to do was revolting. This hurts Edward, but he thinks the blame should be on her. He accuses her of having no idea how to be with a man. Throughout their stay at the hotel, she never let him near her, and she would stop him whenever he initiated intimacy. He calls her stuck up. Florence angrily asks him why he's here, when that's how he thinks of her. He should have just let her be. She offers an explanation. She wants him to be happy, but she thinks she's a disappointment. She thinks she could never give him the things he demands, especially when it comes to intimacy. It will always be her fault if he is unsatisfied, but she can never tell him the real reason why. She can't explain why she felt humiliated earlier. Unfortunately, Edward has understood her meaning to be about money, and he gets more angry. He calls her the B word for even insinuating such an idea. Both of them have hurled hurtful words at each other, words that can never be taken back. Florence tells him to go away. Instead, Edward sits with her. They could have been free, back there at the hotel, and yet they're in this mess. He tries to hold her hand, but she pulls away. Florence suggests a setup to Edward, and this is a deciding factor in their marriage's fate. She tells him she loves him, and she knows he loves her too. But based on what happened at the hotel, Edward should have realized by now that Florence is hopeless at making love. She knows she can never give him what he wants, even if she tries to change. She wants him to be happy and free. Both of them can make their own rules, and nobody has to know. She implies that she's allowing him to do the act with other women when he wants to. In fact, she wants him to, because she knows that's what he needs. She won't get jealous, as long as she's secured by the knowledge that he loves her. Disgusted by her idea, Edward reminds her that they just got married that day. They just made a promise to uphold fidelity, and now she's making these repulsive suggestions. He calls her completely frigid, and there is finality in his words. He turns his back on his wife. Then, we see Florence walking away. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Edward and Florence have finalized their divorce. He retrieves his things from the Pontings, and then he returns home to his family. They question him about Florence and why they have to divorce, but he won't answer them. He even makes his siblings promise to never mention her again. In the next scene, 13 years have passed since the divorce. Edward now owns a record shop. He has chosen to remain single, although he dabbles with women from time to time. During his duty, he meets a young girl who is looking for a Chuck Berry record. She says it will be a gift for her mother on her birthday. She also adds that, even if her mother loves classical music, she likes listening to Chuck Berry because he sounds merry and bouncy. Her words remind Edward of that time when Florence would describe his favorite musician the same way. It's only then that he notices the girl is carrying a violin case. On it is a sticker that says, "And there's more quartet." Edward gets a wave of unforgotten memories and long-buried emotions. He decides to give the record away for free. He asks the girl, who looks so much like Florence, to wish her mother a happy birthday for him. As the girl walks away, he asks for her name. The girl says she's Chloe Morrill, and with that, she leaves. Edward realizes that, indeed, Florence had named her daughter Chloe. Later, he spends his night with his friends and girlfriends. Still moved by the encounter earlier, he relays to them the story of an innocent couple who got married because they loved each other. But on their honeymoon, everything falls apart because the woman admits that she can't have sex. She tells her husband he can do it with anyone she likes. But the husband gets angry. He doesn't understand that it is his wife's way of making him happy, even if she can't fulfill the physical aspect of the marriage. Edward bleakly concludes his story, married for 6 hours. In the next scene, we see that the year is 2007. 32 years have passed since then. Edward is now a member of the local croquet club. As part of his privilege, he gets to play for free with other senior citizens. He's still single, living alone in his old home. As he makes his dinner, he hears the news about the celebrated Ennismore Quartet having their farewell concert at Wigmore Hall. The reporter also includes his interview with the quartet's violinist, Florence Morrill, and her husband Charles, the quartet's cellist, about balancing their musical success with their domestic lives. Edward turns off the radio because he can't listen anymore. Even with the passing of years, he can't bury his love for Florence and his regret for his decision on that fateful day at Chesil Beach. The only way he can peacefully leave the world is to fulfill the very first promise he made to her. And so, on the night of the farewell concert, Edward sits dutifully on number 9, row C. He sees the Ennismore Quartet entering the stage, together with the 5th member. Edward recognizes Florence. She looks at peace, now that she's achieved her lifelong dream of being able to play at Wigmore Hall as a renowned musician. Her children and grandchildren sit in the front row, looking at her with admiration and pride. During the performance, she sees Edward in the audience. By the end of the performance, the two exchange meaningful glances, with tears running down their cheeks. The movie ends with a callback on that day at Chesil Beach. Before Florence walks away, she apologizes for what happened and for the things she said. She beckons her husband to go back to the hotel with her, but he turns his back on her, letting her know he's made his decision. If only they had chosen the other way, they could have made things work, and their love last.